Well, hi, everybody. I'm Aaron Gruben. I'm a veterinarian that also likes to write. I've been writing books since I was in high school about all kinds of things. Today we'll be talking about a book I wrote about Christianity and vet medicine and what God thinks about veterinary medicine and history of Christians that were involved in veterinary medicine. I love to write about history in general. I do some fiction writing and nonfiction writing. Some of my favorite things to write about have been about time travel. So this book's not at all about time travel. So this will be a fun one to talk about.
Wait, now to be fair, this book is not about time travel. However, the first half of it is devoted to what looks like a deep dive into. I tried to look chronologically at who are the Christians who are veterinarians, and you just walk through the history, mostly of Europe, but little touches elsewhere. So it felt like time travel in the beginning. There you go.
That's all, definitely a side of me. I love history and like to dive into those details when I can.
Wait, so you snuck in your introduction kind of something that I was going to ask about at the very beginning, which is, okay,
sure.
You're a writer, you're a Christian, you're a veterinarian. Mm-hmm. Maybe you could say, where did those three things start? What is the order they came in?
Oh, yeah. Good question. Let's see. So I guess ever since I can remember, I've been interested in being a veterinarian whenever I started thinking about a career. And then when I got to high school, started thinking more seriously about it. I started thinking about the things in this book, really. Why would I really want to be a veterinarian, and am I serious about it? And how does that fit into my Christian faith? I became a Christian when I was 9. God convicted me about the truth of the Bible, and I talked to my dad about the gospel, and decided to become a Christian at that point.
Wait, can I ask about your upbringing? So that the possibility that you decided to become a Christian at 9 sounds like you may not be. You are from an Anabaptist faith that says, hey, we can't just do this for you at the beginning. We can't baptize you and call this good. You need to make a decision somewhere down the line. So maybe you could just talk a little bit about, have you kept the same stream of Christianity since you were a little kid? And what was that like, that being a kid? And then at 9, what did it feel like when you finally decided?
Oh, yeah. That's a good question. Yeah. So I basically kept the same stream of Christianity. I'm a Reformed Presbyterian at this point in life. Started out going to a Baptist church and like Bible churches, and just kind of grew up in a Christian family. And my folks were like Bible church kind of people. And then when I first sort of understood what they were talking about when they talked to me about Christianity and Christian ideas, and it really went into my heart, was when I was 9. That was when I was pretty little. I don't have a whole lot of real specific memories, obviously. One thing I do remember is suddenly being interested in going to church every week and started reading the Bible for myself and really trying to understand what the heck all this stuff is about. And it's been a long journey discovering since then. When I went away to vet school is really when I started to investigate like Reformed theology and Presbyterianism more in more detail. I've been going to Presbyterian churches with my parents for a few years before that, but started to think about whether I really believed any of the more specific Reformed doctrines of like Calvinism and things like that, and started to really make those my own at vet school, actually. So that's kind of my journey of faith. I was a deacon for a little while.
For an ignorant non-Christian, when you talk about Calvinism and you think about so you were older in vet school when you're really kind of nailing down the doctrines that you believe. Mm-hmm. Why were your parents exploring? Did they kind of go from church to church through the years? And why did the doctrine of this Reformed Presbyterianism, do you know why that called out to you and why that seemed more right?
Yeah, that's a good question. So a couple different questions in there.
I know.
My parents. So the answer is yes about my parents. They kind of went around to different churches growing up. So I got some exposure to all kinds of different brands of Christianity, you could say. And then as far as Calvinism goes, I guess the main thing is I really started exploring what the Bible says about salvation, especially. So Calvinism is especially a type of like systematic doctrine that lines up logically what the Bible says about faith and salvation and Jesus' work to save us. So it talks of there's 5 points of Calvinism, all things like about talking about how God is the one doing the work to bring you to Him and things like that. I came across those things at some of the churches I was going to and wanted to know what the Bible really said about how God saves us and started reading the Bible itself and a lot of books written by Reformed people and not Reformed people, and just kind of came to the belief that was more biblical. Kind of on a more personal level, I met a fantastic older lady while I was at vet school through the church I was going to, a little tiny church, about maybe 100 people, something like that. Wow. And she had talked to one of her neighbors while she was out walking, and he became a Christian through talking to her. He and I became good friends, and as soon as he had converted, she like immediately started teaching him the catechism, which is like a Calvinist thing through at like a 7:30 every Sunday morning. So I kind of got plugged into that, and those two people really helped me grow in believing the teachings of Calvin and some of the more Reformed doctrines of grace, they call them sometimes. So.
Can I ask, so that's interesting. I think people come in and out of their religions at different points in their life stage, but I do think it's interesting. I asked you, Christian veterinarian writer, it sounds like big things happened with vet school, obviously in vet school, and then big things happened with you kind of settling into the doctrine that you felt like matched what you read in the Bible the most. Was that a coincidence those two things are happening? Or did you find yourself, when you went off to vet school, was this a time when you found yourself searching? What do you think?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think in general, that was a time when I was just searching about what I believed was true personally for myself as opposed to what I'd always been taught. That's one reason those two lined up, really. I think also vet school was a challenging time for everybody. So it made me... when I'm challenged, I tend to turn to my faith and think harder about God and what can sustain me through hard things. And so that's one reason I started thinking more seriously about the Bible too.
Yeah. When you settled in, so during vet school, you kind of like, you're trying to figure out exactly what does Christianity say in the Bible? And I'm agreeing with this church seems like, this is closest to what I believe. This is closest to what I see here. How did that affect what you were learning and how you were thinking about yourself as a future veterinarian? Were there parts about veterinary medicine that made you at all worried as you got really serious and locked down the religion at that time? Or, how did the two affect each other?
That's a good question. It's I guess tricky to relate those in my mind as I developed in my faith and thinking about being a veterinarian, except that I kind of learned more and more about myself, that I wanted to do all the things I was doing for God's glory and as a way to serve Him, basically. So I started thinking a little bit about veterinary medicine as a ministry and a career. That was something that kind of connected at that point in my life. I did a talk along those lines, and actually with a lot of history that ended up in this book too, for the CVF, the Christian Veterinary Fellowship group on campus, and got connected with them a little bit too. But yeah, in general, I guess at that point in time, I started thinking about how my career and specifically how being a veterinarian can be a ministry in different ways to people, and bring God glory.
Okay, so that leads me to the book, A Theology of Beasts, Christians in Veterinary Medicine. Short, super readable. I read it in a couple days. It's interesting. You said you were kind of thinking about Christianity and veterinary medicine, but the first half of the book, and maybe this is just because you'd kind of done this research work already for that presentation, but the first half of the book to me is a bit like a gentle justification for, hey, Christianity and science and medicine sit together, and not only do they sit together today, but they've sat together a long time, and there have been these Christians who had strong faith who are also experimental scientists in veterinary medicine. So why did you want to start the book? If this book is for someone who's Christian and thinking about veterinary medicine or wanting to learn more about it, Why did you think, I want to start off by giving them the history of all these many people along the way who are Christians and contributed to vet med?
Yeah, that's a good question. And to be honest, I almost did it the other way around, actually.
I was wondering.
Yeah, and it just kind of organically flowed better in my mind that way. So I knew I wanted to have a section on Christians in history that were veterinarians, partly because as I thought through the subject, my first question was, well, if God cares about vet medicine and it's something we can do to glorify him, then I would expect, as a scientist myself, and in some ways, I'd expect to see evidence that other Christians have thought about that in the past and cared about vet medicine. So I knew I wanted a section on history for that reason, and then one on theology and one on philosophy. As I wrote my introduction, it just sort of seemed to flow that I would think about first what were some of the stories of people that thought about the question of whether veterinary medicine can glorify God or not first, and then talk about why they believe that afterwards.
Oh, I like it because it starts out, I literally see you using the scientific method in the beginning because you're like, well, if I have a hypothesis that this is part of the calling, this is part of the ministry, that we are called to do this, well, there must be proof through time. So you're like, well, let me go look. And yes, you found the proof through time. Are there particular stories in there that jumped out at you the most, or particular people, or how did it make you feel finding all these historical tidbits of strong belief Christians who are also involved in vet med?
Oh, it's a great question. I felt excited about it, really, and it was kind of like meeting a lot of brothers and sisters. It was a lot of fun. So I guess two of my favorites were William Moorcroft, just because he was such an interesting guy. He was a veterinarian and maybe a spy and a Tibetan explorer, as well as a Christian. So he did some crazy, amazing things. I tend to be a little bit of a Renaissance man myself, basically meaning that I can't keep focused, and I'm always thinking about all these things all together. So I feel a little bit of kinship with him. He did all kinds of things that were just all over the place. So he was a really neat guy to meet in history. I really liked Johann Christian Polycarp Erxleben because of his name. He's got a great name to say.
Wait, I feel like you said that a lot. Like you deployed it very well.
Yeah, for a little while I was like singing it to my kids. I have 6 little kids running around the house here, so he has a fun name to pronounce. So,
it was like your version of John Jacob Jingleheimer Schmidt.
Exactly right, yeah. He was a really cool guy too, though. I was really impressed by his initiative. Started Germany's first vet school just because he saw the need for it and sent a letter to the king, even though he hadn't finished his degree even. And said, not only do we need a vet school, but I'm the guy to do it, and here's my course curriculum I want, and it made it happen. So I think he's an inspiring Christian in vet medicine's history.
I liked it especially because I think there is a general... In general, when you go out into the world, especially in American culture, it feels like there's a conflict between science and religion. And even if there isn't a conflict, it's presented that way. If people don't think it's sometimes presented that way. And it was interesting to see, maybe you could tell me your thoughts on growing up, if there ever felt like there was a conflict between what science and medicine was saying and what you found in theology, and how you see the two mixed together or apart and conflicting.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question, and that's very true. There doesn't necessarily need to be a conflict between science and religion, but it's very often presented that way. Yeah. Growing up, I grew up in a real conservative Christian house, and there was always my parents always fell heavily on the creationist side of a debate about creation and evolution.
Right.
So that's kind of what I was taught growing up. As I started to think about things and kind of make them my own, I had to think about that too, and definitely would consider myself a creationist. I think that you can be a creationist all kinds of different ways consistently, but reading the Bible, I would fall back to 7-day creationism. But yeah, I think that there are lots of different ways to approach science and religion that don't necessarily have to conflict, and really complement each other a lot. And that's one thing I loved reading about some of these early innovators in medicine and science, is how they did their work in medicine as a way to bring God glory and get to know God better even. In a lot of ways, those two are just one and the same. I read a book by Francis Schaeffer a long time ago where he talked about how much we tend to split all of life into two things. I think I mentioned that in this book a little bit too, but it's too easy to like fracture off all our part of our faith and then the rest of life and just sort of have them all divided. But really, I think those ought to be all one thing and just all part of us. So that's kind of how I think about medicine and my faith also. It's just all part of what I do.
So you mentioned, I mean, there were these two parts of the book. They're clear parts. So one part is the history and one part is theology and philosophy. And you're like, at one time, the theology and philosophy could have front-ended it. I like the fact that you kind of showed science and religion interweaving through history. So you finally do get to the theology and philosophy. To you, fundamentally, as a Christian approaching veterinary medicine, are there particular lines or particular ideas that run through the Bible in Christianity that you think pertain to vet med the most? And kind of what are they? Because the one that jumped out to me, obviously, is the one everybody leans on, is in Genesis, where it's talking about man is made sort of Lord or has dominion over the animals. So,
sure, yeah, no, that's definitely an important one. So I think just for, I guess you could say, motivation for studying science and technology and medicine, the dominion mandate, I've often heard it called, is certainly an important basis in the Bible that does kind of run through Scripture. One thing that I think is really exciting about the dominion idea is that I'm so taken. The way I look at dominion, I think when on the phone we talked a little bit about how some people will talk about dominion like it's more a command to be responsible and take care of creation versus a command to just like lord over it and be a tyrant over creation. So one of the exciting parts about being a Christian for me is the teachings in the New Testament from Paul that Christ came to kind of restore everything to the way it should be, not just our souls, but the creation and the right ordering of it too. And I think that plays a big role in the whole stream of dominion in theology, that Jesus restores a proper view of us being responsible in creation and good doctors and scientists at the same time. And following him means trying to do that well also. So that's certainly one major motivation or theological stream. I think that applies definitely to vet medicine in the Bible.
You also mention a few things in theology between sort of kindness and cruelty, and especially in the historical part, you really do show that some of these scientists were, in their own personal writings and in what they shared publicly, they were concerned about the suffering. They were concerned about suffering of animals. So in your view, what does Christianity tell Christian veterinarians about what they should be doing when it involves animals in pain?
Yeah. Oh, that's a good question. Yeah. Yeah. I think that the Bible's more clear than I expected it to be when I started looking at the subject, that God cares about animal suffering and he wants animals to not be in pain, and he cares that we care as well. There are a lot of Old Testament commands where God talks to his people and is commanding them not to do cruel things like boiling goats in their mother's milk and things like that. Then there's just straight up words like the words of Solomon in Proverbs that say a righteous man regards the life of his beast. So part of being righteous and following God and being like him is to not be a fan of animal cruelty and to try to be gentle just like he is. So I think a lot of that is founded in God's character. And it comes out pretty clearly in Scripture when you start thinking about how God wants us to view the animal world around us.
The other thing, I went looking, I was caught by that one you got from Proverbs. I'm like, ooh, let me go look at that. Because you're like, it's not just regards, it also ties to knowledge. And I'm like, does it? Let me go look at the Hebrew. And you were like, right, like it's the word for knowledge, to know. And I love the way from that regards you spun out to, so that means veterinarians need to know about the animals they're caring for. You're supposed to regard them. Knowledge is in there. So I did like that, kind of like, right, of course you have veterinarians, because somebody has to know about the animals to do this properly. Exactly right. Yeah.
No, there's good reasons in the Bible to be a good veterinarian.
Apparently, which I did like that. There was my favorite part of the whole book. So I did like the history stuff, but then once you got into the philosophy, you dug into something which I think then now is in deviation from what we might see in a lot of modern culture. And I don't know if it's around the world this way. These two lines, and I feel like they could work together, but they're a bit in conflict. There's one in which man is seen at the top of a hierarchy. So we are over the animals. We are better than the animals. And the other one that's gained prevalence because as people have learned more about the theories of evolution and the idea that we all came from animals, when they think back in their brains to a time before, they think, well, things were wild. And this is where I thought was interesting. In modern science, I think we think back to a time when things were wild, that nature, red in tooth and claw, is normal. And then you present an alternative view, which I don't think is seen everywhere, where you're like, no, I imagine this sort of like Garden of Eden-esque, the animals were not in conflict. So I thought that was fascinating. So tell me more why you think there's a justification for thinking about the fact that the normal is not the brutality of predators and prey, but animals living together.
Yeah, and that's a great topic to talk about. I ran into that idea reading C.S. Lewis, actually. So Lewis wrote some essays on animal suffering, and that was something he talked about, is that the truly I guess I can't remember the words he used, but the closer you get to the order of creation, the more tame an animal is what his words were. I thought that was a really interesting idea that I hadn't thought about much before I read it in Lewis. And it really squares with the way I think about Genesis in particular. So in the book of Genesis, we do have the Garden of Eden, and everything's perfect before the fall, and then sin comes in, and everything goes downhill from there. And that's where you get death and suffering and pain and all those things that we're fighting as veterinarians. And I do think about the topic of death in particular. We think of it as natural and talk about it as a natural thing. But really, if you look at what the Bible talks about in Genesis, death shouldn't be something that's natural to us. It should be kind of seen as a foreign enemy that shouldn't be there, that someday will be gone again. And that's really integral to the Christian faith in general. That's kind of the same thing with animals and them being red in tooth and claw, like you say. That's not the way it was meant to be, and our hope is that someday things will be different again.
So, and I thought that was super interesting, because I feel like in general the veterinarians I run into are much more so. They're also observational scientists, and just the information in looking at the world, they look out at the world. And if you don't theologically believe the world is fallen, or that it was at a better, some utopian state earlier, then you look out and say, well, we should see what's reflected here. And so I think that leads to, and you point out a problem with this, moral equivalence, as we think, well, we're just another animal. And you spend a lot of time thinking about what are the implications of just saying we're just another animal. It leads to kind of moral equivalence with us and animals. And we don't take responsibility for the animals. Well, if we're all animals, then I can do what I want, because I'm just another animal with my own wants and needs and desires. And I think you say, maybe we shouldn't get rid of that hierarchy. Maybe it's not a bad thing to be above the animals, which I think a lot of people talk about all of nature together and we're all equal. And you push back a little bit. What are kind of the thoughts or the reasoning that you have for pushing back on all animals are the same? Including us.
That's a good question. Yeah. And I mean, the I guess where I start with that idea is really back in Genesis again. So I do think the Bible's pretty clear about its take on that topic that God made man to be the over the animals, and that he made man in his image in particular. So as I looked at this subject about our relation to animals, that became a really interesting subject for me to think of what does that mean to be in God's image, and how does that make us different than the animals? And I think that's really where it starts, is that animals are not made in God's image, and we are, if we're going to take the words of Scripture literally. And fortunately, we're not alone to try to figure out what that means. There's been a lot of different great thinkers for thousands of years now that have debated about that subject. But I thought Thomas Aquinas' writings especially were helpful. That and Calvin. So I think my investigations of Calvinism played a little bit of part of this too. Calvin talked about how our whole self is part of God's image. A lot of people get down on Calvinism just because it's a little depressing. So he often talks about how we're fallen in every part too. So that's one reason I go back to the fall in my head a lot too, is thinking about Calvinism and the important teaching that every part of us is tainted by corruption because of the fall. But the reverse side of that is that every part of us has the image of God. And the Bible is pretty clear that the animals don't share that. So I think that there's an aspect of our nature and of our role that makes us different than animals. It certainly doesn't mean we should be cruel and mean to animals. But it does mean that we shouldn't be thinking of ourselves as equal to animals, or it creates a whole bunch of problems. And I think those problems are kind of the consequence and the outworkings of confusion about the nature of ourselves and animal kind, basically.
I liked, so there's one strand running through animal rights and sort of extremist. So let's say PETA. PETA's pitch is that pet ownership it's morally wrong because animals should live the way they live naturally. And again, I like this pitch. What we're talking about a peaceful time before is I think I must have been sheltered. I'd never heard the philosophical pitch that, no, pet ownership, animals and humans living together in peace, that's the normal thing. Agriculture, we're kind of told these days, because there were times before in historical recorded history, these animals were not domesticated, and these animals did not hang out with us. And it's better for them to be natural. And I'd never heard this pitch that you could look at it this way to say, isn't it better for us to live in peace with the animals in our ecosystem?
Yeah. No, a good example I just thought of is a lot of people get excited about raw food diets. I've heard lots of arguments about that and against it and for it. But one of the things that somebody told me once that really has stuck to me is, raw food is natural for wolves and coyotes to eat, and they live an average of 5 years in the wild. So it's good for dogs to be domesticated and for us to protect them from things like parasites and salmonella and E. coli and things that kill them through their diets in the wild, right? So I think that's true in a lot of ways for every aspect of an animal's life. Is we can definitely help them a lot by domestication and kind of a good symbiotic relationship, if you will. So
it's interesting because one pitch would be almost this a Christian ideal of the pet or domesticated animal with you would lead to lots of caring and lots of money spent and lots of love for these animals, because this is an ideal situation. It's almost like they talk about in Judaism, they talk about Shabbat is like this taste of heaven. Shabbat's when the Messiah comes in Jewish theology, every day is going to be like Shabbat. It's all going to be, everything will be perfect and everything's going to work just right. And this little taste of Shabbat from Friday to Saturday, I feel like this pet ownership is this little taste of, yay, this is this taste of something good.
Sure.
On the other side, you argue against, and I agree with this idea that animals and people are the same. The amount of time and resources that people will devote to animals. So you as a Christian veterinarian thinking about not just animals, but people and what we can do for everyone around us. How do you feel about, and again, if this is too touchy, how do you feel about how much money and time and effort is spent on these little pets, because we're treating them kind of like human beings? What we would spend on a sick kid is what we would spend sometimes on a sick animal.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. Like you say, it's a touchy subject for a lot of people, which was one thing that made me nervous writing this part of the book for sure.
Then you don't have to dive into it if you don't want to.
Oh, no, I'm happy to. Well. I'm happy to, because, and that's why I wrote about it in the book, is I think it's something we need to think about more and more, as it, it's something that we kind of just gloss over a lot of times, I find in my practice anyway. And I think that one of the beauties of the Christian view of man made in God's image is that it really gives you some balance in that regard. I love Chesterton's quote that I talked about in the book, where he talks about how a materialistic view of the world doesn't give you any good place to, he's using a tiger as an example, to admire the tiger's stripes and avoid his claws. But the Christian idea of man versus animals, or in relation to animals, gives you a proper balance to admire the tiger and avoid his claws at the same time. And I think that's real similar in this topic too. We want to take the best care possible that we can of animals, at the same time that we remember that every single time a human is going to be more valuable than an animal. So if we had to choose between one or the two, I guess you could say, then it should always be the human instead. And that's certainly where I would fall down on those that topic for sure. And it certainly is a practical thing in my experience as a practitioner many times. So I always try to, I guess you could say, I'm definitely a bit more of a practical doctor than some of my colleagues, where I do consider things like the cost and whether my clients can afford this, and try to communicate real carefully to them. Do you really want to go through with all of this? Because it does, it gets challenging when I see cases where there's, like a mom with a little kid and she can't really afford any of this stuff I'm talking about. I'll do everything I can to help it work out, but there comes a point where I have to say, look, you probably should just think of something else, So
is there also on the other side of that? Because I look at, so when I went to help veterinarians, I mean, I love pets and animals, but I really like veterinarians. When you talked about this ministry, a lot of times when people are talking about ministry, it's human being to human being. Do you feel like as a veterinarian, your ministry is involved in directly caring for the animal, or when you look at every animal that comes in, is it always this feeling there's this web that goes out to the human beings who are there with them?
Yeah, no, really the latter for sure. That's definitely how I view every case, is that the pet doesn't come in with his own little wallet and credit card and
right.
a list of things that are ailing him, right? There's a whole family of people right there with them, and they're needing help just as much as their pet does half the time. I work at an emergency practice, so a lot of the time my job is to be a counselor to grieving people, and so I think of my work to help them just as much as the animal too.
Yeah. Is there anything in veterinary medicine? So people always talk about veterinary. How do you feel about the big change in veterinary medicine? Feels like, yes, corporatization is one thing, but technology. So a big thing, as the medicine and the technology improves, people are having to wrestle more with the moral issue and the financial issue of, now that we can do everything for the animal, hypothetically, given all the time and all the money, now that we can do that, now we have to do that same thing we've done with everything else in our lives. Now I have to set up some artificial boundary of, I have to decide according to my values how much to spend. I have to decide how do you think that's, as you've been a veterinarian, does drawing that line, is it easier or harder as time goes by? In other words, does it get more complicated the more you can do, or does it still feel good? I love the fact that I can do more stuff for every animal that comes in. Yeah,
that's a good question. I mean, I think overall it makes it easier, just because I guess I view myself in my practice as kind of a consultant in some ways, where I'm working alongside an animal owner to try to help them be a good, righteous animal owner and take care of their pet. So in that regard, the more options that we all have for that, the better. And I think that as we talk about the cost of medicine, in a lot of ways, I always have to remind myself that this is all relative. So, I mean, what's expensive for one person is like just chump change for somebody else, right? And I'm always reminded of that in easy ways and hard ways in practice. that sometimes spending $10,000 for a surgery is nothing to some people, whereas $100 exam fee is not even doable for some folks. So that's definitely a challenge in my practice, and it always has been for every veterinarian I know. But I do think that does get harder the more expensive medicine becomes. So I'm trying to find creative ways to work through that with clients and try to help the pet every way I can and help them help their pet. So.
Okay, my two last questions are more about Christianity and less about the veterinary hospital. So, number one, at the church you go to now, over the course of a standard year, do animals ever show up? Like, do you do those? Some places do animal blessings. Are animals a part of the liturgy in any way significantly?
That's a good question. The answer is no, not really. I mean, everybody has pets, and I get to meet them, and that's about as far as it goes. But yeah, not really part of the liturgy at church, really. But I have some friends who have churches that do animal blessings and things, but I haven't had the chance to do that.
And my last question is kind of thinking about, have young Christians who are thinking about being veterinarians, do you talk to them? And I'm wondering, when you looked at your peers who are Christian, I feel like a lot of things that the organizations do are really good, and they're really designed to say, we know how to be veterinarians, so we can use our skill to go carry this out into the world and help people in places where they can't get pet care. And then we will be good models and examples for how you can use your skills for good. Have you found other veterinarians wrestle with the philosophy and the theology as much? Or do you feel like most of the time vet med and Christianity only come together when they're like, well, a charity, so then I could use my thing for charity?
That's a good question. To be perfectly honest, I haven't talked to a whole lot of my colleagues about some of these. Okay. When I have, I found that they indeed wrestle with all these same questions and are often thinking through them more than I expected. I had a conversation with one of my technicians the other day and went into depth about whether animals have souls and how animals might be different or similar to people. And she'd been thinking about this a whole lot, and I never even thought to talk about it. So I think people do think about it more than we expect in our profession. And I'm just a natural introvert and don't tell people about it and talk about it as much as I should. Instead, I write about it because that's how I function. So my last question is, who do you hope reads this book? Who is the idea in your mind? Who is the ideal audience? Oh, that's a good question. Honestly, I think the ideal audience would be colleagues of mine that are Christians and struggle through some of these same questions that I've had to think about over the years. But really, I think that it's a pretty broad audience that could benefit from it. Not only veterinarians, but people that want to be veterinarians or anybody that's a pet owner, because I guess that's the other big category of people that I hope read this book are people that haven't really thought about the popular equalizing of man and animals, and haven't thought about any kind of alternative philosophies or ideas, because I would like to help present an alternative to that that's been there for thousands of years, and I think it's true.
And is there anything from the book you think I might have missed? Like, is there something we didn't talk about that you really want to talk about that we just skipped?
That's a good question. I think you covered it mostly. I think one of the big things that came out to me in this book is just how wonderful and gentle God Himself is in loving His creation. We talked about that just a little bit. I think that's a wonderful thing, though, that really struck me in my heart writing this book. Is just kind of a worship of God who loves all of creation so much and ordered it so well. So that's really the big message that kind of hit me through writing it.